L'Europe des mécènes, une culture à révéler, un cadre à construire. Et donc pour cela, j'invite à me rejoindre sur scène mesdames Oonagh, Breen et Anne Monier et monsieur Serneels. Je vous en prie, venez me rejoindre. You can come with me on the stage, please. Alors, on va se poser la question de savoir s'il existe un mécénat européen encore. Juste un petit rappel historique rapide, on va dire. Apparu dans la Grèce antique, le mécénat s'est développé en Europe. En France, on va dire qu'il a connu de grandes heures de gloire sous François Ier, un fondateur du Collège de France où on se trouve actuellement. Il a constamment joué un rôle essentiel jusqu'au XIXe siècle et pourtant, c'est le modèle de la philanthropie américaine dont on parlait un instant qui, depuis le XXe siècle, inspire le mécénat contemporain. Cette différence, finalement, du mécénat européen, on va dire qu'elle est peu exprimée encore. Les points communs entre les pays de l'Union, encore peu documentés. Sa doctrine et son cadre juridique et législatif, on peut dire, sont encore à construire. Donc, on va essayer d'en savoir un peu plus et d'en discuter avec nos intervenants. Donc, là, je parle encore un peu français, mais bientôt, je parlais anglais. Donc, je vous rappelle, si vous avez besoin de casque, peut-être encore des hôtesses vont circuler, mais cette table ronde va avoir lieu en anglais. Donc, on est ravis d'accueillir Anne Monier, docteur en sciences sociales au centre Maurice Halbwachs, je vais y arriver, je vais prononcer ça correctement quand même, et post-doctorante à l'université Paris 8 qui va nous éclairer en particulier sur la philanthropie américaine, justement en comparaison. Là, il n'y a pas de modèle européen, mais on va voir comment on peut se comparer les uns et les autres. On a ravi d'accueillir Oonagh Breen, hello, professeur à UCD Sutherland School of Law de Dublin, pour parler entre les deux langues, qui est classée quand même parmi les 100 meilleures universités du monde en droit et principal centre de formation et de recherche juridique en Irlande. Et puis nous avons enfin Serneels. Hello, bonjour. CEO de EVPA, European Venture Philanthropie Association. Donc, c'est une association qui promeut l'aventure philanthropie en Europe. So, we will start with you, Stephen. You can go at the desk because we will start with, as soon as we can do it, a quick tour of Europe to see with you what is the particularity of Europe, and after you will talk. Yes? No, if you go at the desk, you will have a microphone.
I don't like behind the desk.
No, okay.
No, thank you.
You do as you want.
Yes, thank you very much. So, warm welcome from my side as well, and happy to be here with all of you. We were in Paris already yesterday with this beautiful weather, so it's a good time to be here. Could I have this one and only slide? I'm only going to show one slide. Yeah. You can tap. Yeah, thank you very much. Because before I dive into philanthropy, I'd like to share with you the broader perspective of where philanthropy is in this whole world which is changing. And what we see happening is that on the top line, you see how big organizations are repositioning themselves. On the one hand, you see where classic for-profits that truly take profit as their motive, as their leitmotif, how they're moving to inclusive businesses. And in France in particular, you see the Danones, the Schneiders, the Totals, they all try to see how they can embrace the social inclusion, the green environmental challenges, and so on and so forth. The same is happening at the other side. We know that the not-for-profits have a hard time. Government is not spending as much money as they used to do. The donors become more critical. So also the not-for-profits, they try to move and try to discover business models and how to become financially sustainable. Still taking the social motive first, but at least they're moving as well. Now, next to the business layer, there is a financial layer, and they go hand in hand. Because on the financial layer, what you see is that also today, the investors, more and more ESG criteria, socially responsible investing becomes the norm. So people try to be conscious when they invest that it's not only about the financial return, but also about environmental inclusion and social inclusion. On the long term, on the long haul, they hope they're going to de-risk their investments and get a better return on the long haul. And the same is happening on what I would call classic philanthropy. Classic philanthropy is growing, or philanthropy is still growing, but you see different formats arising. And what we see is that you've heard probably the term impact investing or social investing. And so philanthropy, and at EVPA we try to figure out philanthropy, is it still there, and what's the purpose and what is the longevity of philanthropy at heart. So that's sketching where philanthropy is nowadays. Now, if I dive into philanthropy, as the professor was saying, in Europe, it's first of all very hard to get numbers. I hear numbers, report dating back to 2013, that the whole giving in Europe would be between 80 and 100 billion. And then the majority, 50%, is even retail, and only 20% are foundations. And then you have DAFNA, the Association of European Foundation Associations. They come up with a different number, 60 billion. 60 billion should be the number that covers, let's say, what foundations represent in Europe. But then if you take a deep dive, and in the panel we're going to have a much deeper dive than I'll share with you, but if you take a deep dive, then you see that there are very different models. As you indeed indicated, there are the Anglo-Saxon models where they sit a little bit as opposed to the state. There are other models, the Rhineland model, where they combine and they co-create with the state. We all know that the welfare state is well developed in the Scandinavian countries, so less appetite for this type of philanthropy. They go more in arts and other stuff. And in Southern Europe, their religion, Catholic religion, comes into play, and they sit very close to philanthropy. So we see different models, and even in countries, long history, but very scattered, very specific, and very isolated. We even had a discussion 2 days ago, when I was there as well, with the European Commission. There were some members of parliament. They don't discuss philanthropy at the European Parliament. Transnational giving is pretty hard, so even the money that's available remains mainly in the countries. So we're lobbying to make that all work, but it's a hard job to do. So what I'd like to do with you is to indicate from EVPA's perspective what is happening in this whole change from classic philanthropy into impact investing. And when I say classic philanthropy, I mean the rather short-term, emotion-driven giving, which is fine, which is great. First question, will that be around? I'm sure that will be around for many, many, many decades to come, centuries to come. Because if there is a disaster or if there are other activities, I mean, we don't have to think too long. We just have to act and put money where it's needed. But said so, we see a couple of trends happening with classic philanthropy. First, donors become more critical. And I always say, giving a donation is the easiest thing you can do, and it's the hardest thing you can do. It's very easy if you give money, and that's it. You don't follow through, you don't ask them for reports back, and you leave it at the stage where you say, this was my heart, I gave the money, that's it. But just think that you want to follow through. Just think that you want to know this grant is for education, this grant is for health, this grant is for whatever. If you want to follow through what this grant really activates, then you're in a much more difficult position than the investors. Because as an investor, you know there are benchmarks. Is it 3% return? Is it 7% return? 20% return? You have a benchmark. As a philanthropist, it's very hard to have benchmarks and to measure the impact you generate. So giving grants is a very hard thing if you want to see what this grant is really catalyzing. Hence, we support very much this impact management and impact measurement, which is crucial to become strategic when you do grant giving. Another element is that if you provide a grant, you don't want to be around for the next 20 years. And if you withdraw, then it all collapses. So you have to start thinking about an exit. This is pretty hard as well, because you give money, and at the same time you know that if you want to make it sustainable or solve the cause, you should have an exit. That's where catalytic philanthropy, Bill and Melinda Gates, they started to invest big time, big money into malaria, because they think, they hope, that in X time, 7 years, 10 years, or the market, or the public players will take over and malaria will be solved by public or markets that then will follow through. So defining the impact, defining The exit is something very hard to do. The last thing I'd like to say about grants is that, in fact, with grants, we can do much more sometimes than we think. I'm the chairman as well of Campani. Campani is a fund, an impact first fund, so we truly go for social impact, and we support small-scale farmers in the south. And what we feel is that those small-scale farmers are very fragile. Their enterprises, their social enterprises are easily disrupted. So in order to de-risk that, we had the idea, and we're not the only ones, we had the idea that in order to de-risk this and attract more money into our fund where we invest in equity, we should have alongside a donation. Now you're going to say to me, how on earth would a donor help investors make money? Well, that's right, but you have to think it maybe in another way. If every euro you donate catalyzes 5 euros of investment, and this investment truly creates social impact, then with this 1 euro, you get much more return also on your social impact and your social change you bring forward than when you would just keeping on giving that 1 single euro to every farmer that's in the field. So we have to start thinking impact measurement, impact management, exits, and also how to have hybrid models where donations and other types of money can come together for the social cause. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. So we talk about the evolution of European philanthropy. Maybe now with Oonagh, we can see much more the particular, the countries, talk about the countries, what is happening with patronage in neighbor countries. Maybe are there some difference between the south, the north, the center? It's important to see a little bit more about what is it. Yes, I'll let you speak. Okay.
Thank you, Natalie, and good morning, and thank you for the invitation to be with you. And my apologies that you are doing this in English, because my French is not good enough. Je ne parle pas le français couramment, malheureusement. What's happening in Europe? Well, we have a number of very interesting trends. We have a long tradition of philanthropy, which I know Anne will speak further about in a few moments. But as a sector, it's young and it's thriving. And if we begin to look at some of the research that has been done in this area, Daphne in 2017 estimated that there were 146,000 public benefit foundations in Europe. And this is based on data from 24 of our European member states. And based on that data, they estimated that there was about 497 billion in assets sitting, waiting to be tapped for philanthropic purposes. And of that, 51 billion is used in charitable spending every year, annually. If we look in terms of the numbers of bodies, are they growing? Is philanthropy growing in Europe? In Germany, and Alan has addressed this already in his opening remarks, Germany has the largest number of foundations in Europe. Yet, did you know that more than 70% of those foundations were established after German reunification? So that's a massive growth since the 1990s. In France here, between 2001 and 2014, the number of French foundations grew by 267%. And these figures come from the European Foundation Centre, who keep a very close finger on the pulse of what is happening throughout Europe. In Spain, almost 70% of the foundations there are less than 18 years old. So they're still in their teenage years in terms of what they can do. Strategically, when we look across Europe, exactly as Steve has pointed out, we have a difficulty because it is very difficult to count accurately the number of philanthropic organizations. We call them different things. Even between civil law and common law jurisdictions, we take very different legal approaches. The foundation is something you are very familiar with here in civil law jurisdictions. It is not comparable. We use the label foundation in Ireland, in England, in Scotland and Wales, but it is not a legal status. Underneath the label of foundation in these common law countries, you will find a trust. You will find a company limited by guarantee, a different legal structure. So we don't have this idea of incorporation without members. This doesn't exist in common law countries. We also have different legal definitions of what it is to be charitable, what public benefit means. We agree on many core elements, but those differences are very important, and they manifest themselves when we try to work together at a European level, when we try to come up with a homogeneous approach. And we have, if you have followed this area over the last 20 years, you will know we tried to introduce a European association, a vehicle that would be recognized in every member state without you having to set up again anew in each country. This failed. We tried to set up a European foundation. This too failed. We tried twice to set up a European mutual society. This too failed. Why? Because we have different approaches, different requirements, different minimum capital requirements, different definitions of what public benefit is between our member states. Having said all that, there are a number of commonalities that we see across the European member states. One thing is that we are all revisiting our regulation. We are all recategorizing, reforming what we view in the 21st century to be philanthropic. So Ireland had a new Charities Act in 2009, a new definition of what it is to be charitable. England went there in 2006. Italy brought in a brand new third sector code in 2017. And here in France, you had your French law on social and solidarity economy in 2014. We are all coming back to these issues and approaching them in different ways. If we are going to facilitate this cross-border philanthropy, if we're going to bring together our jigsaw pieces and solve the greater puzzles that are out there, certain things are necessary. We do enjoy free movement of capital under the European treaties. So philanthropic capital has the same protection as for-profit capital when it comes to crossing borders in the EU, and this is important. Other great steps forward is in the area of tax. Now, we know every member state has sovereignty when it comes to tax, but the Court of Justice has held that member states must treat a comparable foreign EU-based charity in the same way that they would treat a domestic charity in their own member state. So we have this principle of non-discrimination on the basis of nationality. And this is very important. It's there in principle, it's there in theory. Our work at national level is to ensure it is there in practice. And we have had many cases before the European Court of Justice, and we now need to work on the practice of ensuring that the procedures for when you make a grant to a recipient in another country, to a recipient organization, that it is recognized, that the procedures are comparable. So we need to reduce the bureaucratic system that is there and to make it more transparent. We also face challenges within the EU if we are to protect the space for philanthropy. And we can see this particularly in Hungary at the moment. In Hungary last year, the government there introduced a new law that affects the foreign funding of NGOs. So if you are a foundation in Hungary and you receive more than 24,000 euros from foreign funding, even from another EU country, you're required by law to register as a foreign-funded organization and to put this up on all of your websites, and then to tell the registering court who all your donors are. So you can imagine how this chills the space for philanthropy in Hungary. The Commission has taken a procedure, an infringement procedure against Hungary for this. It will come before the Court of Justice. It breaches free movement of capital. It breaches the fundamental charter rights that Alain referred to earlier on. But it takes time to break down these barriers. So there are good things happening. To conclude, along with Stephen, I think there's some wonderful work happening in the social economy space. And I think this is where the real potential will come from. We see that France and Spain and Italy and the UK, in fairness, have been working on the social economy space. In England, we see the development of the community interest company, a brand new legal vehicle to facilitate social enterprise. And I think this is very, very important. And I'm very heartened to see new proposals coming from the Commission that will enable philanthropic organizations to make better investments in social enterprise and social investment under the forthcoming Invest EU programme. And hopefully there will be an opportunity to talk about the great potential that is there for all of us in this space over the course of today. I'll leave it there for the moment, Natalie. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, water is very good. At the end of the roundtable, we will talk again about transnationality and maybe obstacle. I've got just one question for Stephen and Oonagh about the image of patronage. Is it good in the European country? Is it encouraged, you think? You can take the microphone, please.
The microphone makes life so much easier. My apologies. When I think we come to the image of philanthropy, I was talking with Steve this morning over breakfast of the challenges of this area. And I said to him, we are really creating a zoo. This makes it difficult to count, but it encourages diversity. It encourages pluralism. You don't know what will be around the corner when you come. And because this is where philanthropy fits. We are not the state, we are not the market, we are at the grassroots level. We see the problems coming before the others do. And we have this opportunity to work in this space. So the definition has to be fluid. We don't want it to be rigid. We want those new animals coming in, not just the dogs and the cats. We're not counting ducks. We really do want a zoo at the end of the day.
Yes.
Yes, that's a very nice image. I think that indeed this whole social economy you're referring to is disrupting to a certain extent this philanthropic classic space. So there again, there is a good thing about it because disruption allows for innovation, for new models coming up, new ways of financing, so that's good. At the same time, I'm also conscious that we should not throw away the child with the bathwater. I mean, classic philanthropy has a role to play and will have a role to play. Only, as I said in my speech, I think that apart from some, as I said, disaster relief programs and other things where you should, 50%, that's what the report tells us, 50% is still retail donations. And retail donations comes from the heart. Those individuals don't ask for, let's say, long-term and elaborate reports. But in the end, also the public wants to see what does this money bring. So philanthropy should live up at the same time to some of its requirements, which is better demonstrating the outputs, the outcomes for those who know the theory of change and the impact they realize. So good things again, but also some elements we have to step up the game.
Alain Suppiot said that there is no European model. We often make comparison with American philanthropy. So I will ask you, Anne Monier, about this American model. And maybe you can see what is the specificity also of European philanthropy.
Thank you. So I would like to mention 3 elements. First, the international context and the influence of the American model. Second, the differences between France and the US. And third, some ideas and challenges for the future. So first, the international context of philanthropy and the influence of the American model. First, I would like to remind that when we talk of philanthropy, we mean modern philanthropy, which means institutionalized, organized, and professionalized philanthropy. So this modern philanthropy was born in the US after the Civil War, but it's mostly after World War II that this kind of philanthropy, this modern philanthropy, turned into an organized and professionalized nonprofit sector. So we can really not understand European philanthropy nowadays without looking overseas to the American model, which has inspired Europe in many ways. For example, French practitioners go to the US to see how things are done there. Also, there are many French organizations who imported practices and ideas and structures from the US model. To give just an example, the Fonds dotation law, which was adopted in 2008, was directly inspired by the American endowment funds. So when you work in the philanthropic sector in Europe, you definitely look overseas. It's very important to be aware of that influence and to reflect on the role it should have in European philanthropy. Also, nowadays, modern philanthropy is global. There are many flows and movements, flows of donors, because elites are global and they travel everywhere, but also flows of gifts, of donations. People give abroad, and as it was said by my colleague, we should really consider this in relationship with the flows of capital. And also, as I said, flows of thought, of practices, of ideas. So it's very important to keep in mind the international context when we think of European philanthropy, but also the American model and its influence. So second, the differences between France and the US. So although there are several differences between the different European countries, as Oonagh said, we can say that there are some specificities of Europe, and I will go back to the comparison between France and the US to the Tocquevillian perspective on three elements. First, general interest, intérêt général, as we say in France, or public interest in English. So in France, there is a Rousseauist conception of general interest, which means, for Rousseau, general interest is not the addition of private interests, but it is understood as the interest of all, transcending and overcoming private interests. So each individual waives his own private interests for the common good. While in the Anglo-Saxon perspective, general interest is the product of the confrontation and adjustments of different private interests. So second, social bond. Social bond is not the same in France and in the US. In France, there are the citizens and there is the state. In the US, there is a third level, which is the community. And the community is a key concept to understand how Americans bond and how American society works. And third, the role of the state. In France, the state is the guardian of general interest, of the common good, while in the US, the state is there to create the necessary framework to allow all interests to express themselves. So the role of the state is not the same in France and in the US. Also, in Europe, there are differences. I wouldn't say that France is like one country. There are really many differences between countries, but it's a good example of the differences between Europe and the US. But today, the state is changing, and so does philanthropy. So philanthropy has two boundaries, one with the public sector and another one with the private sector. And while the relationship with the public sector has advanced, as we have seen, civil society has grown, and collaboration between the public and the non-profit sector are common nowadays, the shift towards the private sector seems to be more complicated, and Stephen has talked about it. In the US, philanthropy is really shifting towards the profit sector with ideas like investment returns or LLC structures. So in Europe, this shift towards the profit sector is being put into question. Can you really apply company management methods to the public sector, startup management to run a country, or profit sector management to do philanthropy? Is it philanthropy if the benefits are too high? So to understand these difficulties, the roles of culture, history, and representations are really key. Europeans and Americans do not have the same idea of what generosity is. And they do not have the same idea of what the role of the state should be. And they definitely do not have the same relationship to money. So it's very important to take this into account and find a third way, a European way of doing philanthropy. So third point, some ideas and challenges for the future. As I said, we really have to invent an original model of European philanthropy, a hybrid model based on the idea of co-construction between different actors. First, it could be interesting to create a project, an initiative, to think about this new model of European philanthropy. Three aspects would be in this project. The first aspect would be to offer very concrete proposals to the European Commission through institutional changes. For example, new tax laws, new structures that could facilitate European philanthropy. Second aspect, to develop a vision of this European philanthropy model, asking questions like, what is our specificity? Which elements of the American model do we want to import, and which ones do we not want to import? Also, what should be the role of philanthropy in society in contributing to general interest? And also, how to articulate the roles of public and private sectors in a practical way. And third aspect of this project would be, and it was mentioned by my colleagues, a communication aspect to mobilize people. This initiative should bring together practitioners, researchers, lawyers, donors, but it should also mobilize citizens from all over Europe. So this could be done through a media campaign, through social media, but also through a network of people who would be ambassadors, advocates for the cause. So I think it's very important not to think only about concrete and institutional aspects, but also to have a real vision and a network of people who would support the project. And some challenges for the future. So beside this initiative, it's very important to include this question of European philanthropy into the current debates on the European political project. It's part of a wider question, what kind of Europe do we want? And in a philanthropy perspective, the central question would be, do we want a Europe based on solidarity or a Europe based on competition? And last but not least, and to conclude, at a time of democratic crisis, when in several European countries the gap between elites and people is widening and populism is rising, and at a time of increasing inequalities, it's very important to think of philanthropy in relationship with the democratic project. This means redefine the roles of elites in society, but also redefine general interest, all the more as there are new key issues like the environment, global warming, or immigration, and also redefine the terms of European democracies. So we really have to think about which model of society do we want, and this should be really done with European citizens. And maybe then our thoughts on European philanthropy could contribute to the renewal of democracy. Thank you.
We saw that there are a lot of differences. Do you think that we can identify a new European culture? Don't forget your microphone.
It's very hard to say that, because I don't want to essentialize European culture. And I think culture is made of a lot of diversity, and it's really its richness. But I think maybe our common points would be a common will to create a Europe, but also the representation we have of solidarity, of the way the state, but also civil society and people engagement and commitments are really different. And maybe in that point there is something common in Europe. But it's very, very hard to say, besides like the networks of people and the exchanges of ideas, that we have this or this point that is really common in Europe. But it's something we could create. So there's hope.
Do you want to react on that, and maybe Stephen, to what said Anne about the model, the American model. A question maybe we can ask, we can think about the risk of being too inspired by this American model, American philanthropy.
I just wanted to pick up on a quick point that Anne made to give her some hope for the future in her final, the project that we should embark upon, Natalie. The idea of bringing together the foundations and the policy makers and coming up with the plan for European philanthropy. And I want to let you know that train has left the station, that we are doing that. Last year, the European Foundation Council, the EFC and Daphne came together with their members to commission a report on what is the space for philanthropy, enlarging the space for European philanthropy. And I had the pleasure of researching that for them, and we're using that as the basis now for looking ahead as to how do we engage with those who have the power at a European level, but also at a national level. What do we need to do to not alone protect the space we currently have, but also to enlarge it. The other thing that the European Economic and Social Committee has done is that they've begun to plot out the agenda for civil society, that much bigger concept, that bigger umbrella under which philanthropy fits. What's the agenda for 2030? And they have a very interesting report that was published in the last year that talks about this agenda for 2030. And they look towards these challenges exactly as Anne has addressed. What's going to happen to our philanthropic organisations when you have to deal with the rise of populism, when you have to deal with digitalisation and how social media changes things very quickly in that space of fake news? And there are some really wonderful insights in that report, and I commend it to you if you haven't had an opportunity to look at it, because it draws from all of the member states, philanthropic organisations and associations who contributed to it. Because if we can see what lies ahead, we can begin to plan better for it. So we can learn from the Americans, we can learn from everyone, but you always have to be conscious of the space into which you want to transplant that learning. It has to have a good climate here, or it will wither up and die.
Stephen.
Yeah, maybe a quick comment as well. I think in the end we should not forget that why we're doing this is to tackle a social cause. That should come first. And philanthropy or social investing or whatever you call it, impact investing is a means to an end. That's crucial to remember. And that gives also a little bit space in our mind that we should not get stuck whether impact investing is right or wrong, or whether philanthropy and grants are right or wrong. We should apply the right instruments to solve the social cause. And that's the big difference between what we call at EVPA investing for impact versus investing with impact. There are a lot of financiers out there, and they're doing great stuff. They invest with impact, which means they're investors. And they de-risk their investment because they think if they invest in green bonds or in other things, they might have a better return. They're investors. They invest with impact. Great. This is a space that will become trillions of dollars. We, as philanthropists, as social investors, we invest for impact. Impact is the leitmotif. Impact is what we aim for, and philanthropy, grants, social investing is a mean to an end. And I hope that this kind of positioning and framing helps us to think wider than whether philanthropy is good or bad, social investing is good or bad. We should leave that discussion aside and take the social cause first. As you say, migration, fake news, these kind of things. We should solve them.
And I've got a last question about transnationality. Oonagh talked about this subject during your presentation. What are the obstacles for you for a better transnationality of patronage? You have, no, it's her. You don't have a question. You don't have the answer. She give all the good example. Okay.
I think it comes back to really what I talked about earlier, Natalie. We have more than 50 plus pieces of legislation throughout the EU with how we each individually approach philanthropy. We all agree on the benefit. We all have a strong belief in the value of philanthropy. There's no dispute over that. But the devil is always in the detail, as the lawyers will tell you. And it's when you come down to carrying out that philanthropic transaction, particularly when you want to cross a border. And philanthropy doesn't stop at borders. But yet, and this is something that we have to be very conscious of, within the EU, we have not yet arrived at that moment where we can say we have a single market for philanthropy, the same way that we have a single market for for-profit entities. And I think that's our biggest challenge at the moment, to educate the policymakers as to the concrete difficulties that we face when we enter into those daily transactions, to work with the lawyers then and the accountants and everybody else, the tax experts that we need to begin to solve them, whether on a bilateral or on a multilateral basis. We would all like to see better tax provisions for us all. We have been down this road before. This is one of the main reasons why the European Foundation statute failed, and I think you have to learn from past lessons. The tax, the common tax for everybody, when we all maintain tax sovereignty, this is not going to happen. So let's walk away from that one for the moment and be very realistic in both our asks and in what we set out to do, because incrementally we improve this transnational giving. Fondation de France here is part of the Transnational Giving Europe network, which enables tax-efficient giving. And I think that's something that everybody should be supporting while we wait for the single market of philanthropy to arrive.
Okay. Do you want to react, to say something more, Anne? Okay. Well, I think we can talk a long time about this subject, but thank you very much to each of you. Merci beaucoup à vous tous d'être intervenus sur cette question européenne et ce panorama. On voit qu'il y a encore beaucoup à faire. There's a lot of things to do. Thank you very much. On peut vous applaudir. Alors, comme je vous disais, cette matinée